some of you guys may know this, but the Olympics, they were supposed to happen. The Summer Olympics were supposed to happen last summer, but because of the pandemic, they've been pushed now to this summer. And Tokyo in Japan is the host nation, and Japan's the host nation. Tokyo is the host city of the Olympics. And one of my greatest dreams has always been to go to the Olympics to see the opening ceremonies. My wife and I actually had a trip planned this last year before the pandemic started to actually go to Japan, maybe even kind of just get into the Olympics. So sneaking in would literally get us killed. That would not be good. We're just like these crazy Americans, like, come on, we gotta go. Turns out tickets to the opening ceremony are $16,000 a person. Yeah. I was like, are you kidding me? And then I realized there's only 70,000 seats, and there's a lot more than 70,000 people that want to go to this event, and it's way more, famous than the Super Bowl. Us Americans, we're like, oh, the Super Bowl, and everybody else in the world is like, Super Bowl? Like, are you kidding me? Like World Cup, Olympics, like that's what they care about. But $16,000 a ticket, so we decided not to go. Right? We were like, we can't afford that. We don't want to, all of our life savings gone. But anyways, Tokyo is hosting the Olympics, and kind of thinking about that, you think about the Olympics, the reality is, and this happens every single 4 years, is that there is something in our world today that when we think of a city or a nation that gets to host the Olympics, and they get to become titled, like they get to receive the title of an Olympic city, that is one of, if not perhaps the greatest honor from a publicity perspective that a country and a city can have. I mean, you think about the next cities that are going to actually host Olympics. You've got LA. I think you've got London already did it, but then there's a couple other cities going on in different countries and all that. But even LA, Los Angeles, is going to host the Olympics, and that city is just like going berserk because of the opportunity that they have to not only represent the United States, but also to represent America to the entire world. In 1896, if you guys don't know this, in 1896, the Olympics were restarted. They've been around for thousands of years, but they had paused for about 1,500 years or so because most people actually thought it was a pretty corrupt system. And so for 1,500 years, Olympics didn't exist. But in 1896, in Athens, Greece, the world decided, let's start up the Olympics. And so all of these countries started vying every 4 years to become host cities. And over the course of the last 100 and some odd years, every city has gotten this chance. People have celebrated. And what I find really interesting about countries and cities that become host cities, they become these Olympic cities, and they usually get these big banners, and they're Olympic city of whatever, is that there is this level of commitment and level of showmanship that takes place that you don't see under any other circumstances. Like every single country, when they get chosen to become an Olympic city, they spend billions upon billions of dollars to woo and awe the world. The Tokyo Olympics are actually costing the city of Tokyo and their taxpayer dollars $38 billion to host the Olympics. Guys, that's like more than what many states of the entire United States are worth. Right? Like this is incredible money. So they're investing billions upon billions of dollars. If you guys know the story of how Britain, London, UK, how they hosted the Olympics, they spent about $15 to $20 billion to prep for the Olympics. And the notorious thing is that they built all of these stadiums and they're now empty. That they built it for the PR, they built it for the events, and now nobody is going anywhere. No one is participating in any of these facilities. It was all for the show, and so they spend all of this money to become an Olympic city. Some cities actually rework all of their public transit because they don't want the world to see just how actually janky of a city they really are, and so they redo their subways and they redo their buses, and they go through all this effort to kind of fix the entire system. They're like, no, we're a great city. Like, look at us, look at our big buildings. Look at our incredible public transit. They'll do everything and anything, and not short of sinful, broken, disgusting stuff. They'll even go low as possible because they're an Olympic city. If you think about when Russia held I think it was the Winter Olympics, and this would have been at least 6, if not maybe 10 years ago. I can't remember the exact date. But do you guys remember when Russia facilitated the Winter Olympics? Like the stuff that came out in this corrupt government that we as Americans got to see was absolute insanity. Like first they vied for it, and most people believe that they bought their space, their Olympic city status. And then they chose this very strange location that really never got much snow, but they were like, oh, no, we get snow in this city. And it's just like, okay, yeah, sure, Miami gets snow too, right? Like, okay, sounds good, Putin, like, right on, Russia, you guys are awesome, right? So they get chosen as an Olympic city, and then all this news started coming out. That as helicopters were flying by and as news stations were coming in and as they were trying to evaluate the progress of them becoming the Olympic city, all of a sudden we heard rumors that they made homelessness illegal because they needed to clean up the streets. And so they were putting homeless people, homeless Russians in prison because if you slept in the streets of a city that was about to be the Olympic city, oh, no, we can't have that happen. So they started imprisoning people. And then, I don't know if you guys heard this story, they started euthanizing thousands of stray dogs in the city. Dogs were running around all over the place. Russia, I guess, just has dogs everywhere. And so Putin decided, let's start just killing all of these stray dogs because we can't have the world see this Olympic city be dirty and with homeless people and with dogs. So let's kill them all off. And then when there was no snow and everybody was like, how is Shaun White gonna slay that half pipe if there's no snow? They started going, oh, no, what are you talking about? And so they started sending old video footage of previous years worth of snow because they were trying to convince people that they had enough snow. I don't know if you guys knew this or not, but the whole deal was like, we're an Olympic city, we got this, the PR's great, we'll do anything to make it look like we're amazing. When China hosted the Olympics, I don't know if you guys remember this whole debacle, but when China hosted, human rights just were enraged because the amount of money that China spent versus the amount of production they got out of building their buildings and redoing their cities and redoing their public transit. The only way that they could have done what they did was by using child labor, by using sex slaves to be transported in and out of the city so that way workers could use and abuse women and children while they worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week building these buildings. There was literally just slavery happening where people were being purchased and forced into making buildings for China. And then word gets out, China's corrupt. Like the whole media was like, oh my gosh, China. And it was like, are you kidding me right now, right? Like this, I've been there. Like this is pretty messed up, right? And then they started changing the narrative. Like, we're an Olympic city. We can't have people thinking that we have child labor issues and sex slave. We can't do that. And so they started spinning the narrative with their own propaganda, saying, no, the world's against China. No, we're an Olympic city. We have honor. We have privilege. In our modern day today, really doesn't matter if a country is deemed as good or not, a capitalistic country, a communist country, whatever you want to call it. Hosting the Olympics, becoming an Olympic city, brings out corruption. It brings out some of the worst things that a nation does. It's been happening for about 120 years. And what's interesting is about 2,000 years ago, if you rewind the history books to 2,000 years ago in the first century, when the book of Revelation was written right around 90 AD or so, when Christianity was about to flourish, the reality is that for you to become an Olympic city was just as corrupt, just as big of a deal, if not more of a big deal, than what we even know of today. So in the first century, in the Roman Empire, the Olympics, they were always hosted. There was always one host city. That never really changed that much. It was always held in this city called Olympus, which is where we get the name Olympics. And then you also had Olympia, the place of the gods, right? And so Olympus was the host city for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years for the Olympics. And this was a place where they had all these different temples and god worship and all these kinds of crazy things going on. They had this huge stadium that they say sat up to 40 or 50,000 people, and yet because they didn't have sound systems, you could hear someone whispering at the bottom of the stadium or something just bonkers. And I don't even understand how that's possible, but people loved that city. But interestingly enough, the idea of becoming an Olympic city had really nothing to do with whether or not you hosted the Olympics or not. You may host like a chariot race or something in one city because Olympus wasn't that big of a city, but it really had nothing to do with actually being an Olympic city by gathering people for the games. It wasn't really about hosting games or anything like that, but for the Greeks and Romans, for about 1,000 years or so, the idea of becoming an Olympic city was all about hosting, not the games, but gods. It wasn't about games, it was about hosting gods. If you were a city that was large enough to be for everything that Greece and Rome stood for. You were a political entity that had power, that would manipulate and dominate and destroy anybody came in your path. And if you were economically viable to the point where you gave to Rome considerable amounts of wealth and prestige, and you gave honor to Caesar, and you did all these things, but most important, if you were a city that had the capability and the landscape to be able to honor the gods, or to host the gods with specific temples, then you could potentially become an Olympic city. And the most important god that you had to host if you were going to be an Olympic city, a place of Olympia, is that you needed to host the god Zeus, the greatest god of the Roman and Greek Empire, Zeus. You had to worship him. You had to adore him. This is what was required to be an Olympic city. And fascinatingly enough, the city of Pergamum, which is the city and church that we're studying today in Revelation chapter 2, happened to be one of those cities that was vying to become an Olympic city. They fit the bill of what you would describe of as a perfect city for Olympia. I actually have a picture. This is a painting that was painted a long time ago. This is ancient Pergamum. Now, if you guys can kind of get an idea of what's going on here, Pergamum, if you actually look at it today, it's a different name, but in Turkey, this city still exists. Now, it's mainly just ruins for the most part, and there's still an actual Turkish city there, but this is what Pergamum looked like in its heyday. Now, if you look at the landscape, this city was immaculate. One, it's a city on a hill. It's got all of the protective aspects of what you would want from a city that hosts the gods. It's high enough in the sky that the god of Zeus could come down and rain down, the god of Artemis, the god of Apollo, whatever it may be. And so it was high enough. It was protected by this region, this mountainous region. And what's interesting about the city of Pergamum, out of all the cities that we talk about in the churches of Revelation, is that this city at the very top of its kind of mount, if you will, and you can see it right at the very top. There's this building with a ton of pillars and kind of this temple-looking thing, is that right at the very top of that city was actually a temple made on behalf of Caesar Augustus in worship to Caesar. So historically, Greeks and Romans did not always worship as gods their different Caesars. That really didn't start happening until right around the 1st century or so. It wasn't, they were always just considered kings or Caesars or lords. But in the city of Pergamum, they were given the right and the privilege of being able to build with taxpayer dollars a temple made explicitly to worship what they called the King of Kings. This was worshiping the president, worshiping the Lord, worshiping the Caesar Augustus. And so this city and its incredible wealth and its incredible prestige had a temple right at the very top, and the people of the city would go to the top of that, and they would give offerings to Caesar himself, the God-man. The God who is fully human and fully divine, which is sounds a little bit familiar to the Christian view that we have of Jesus Christ. So this city had their temple of Augustus, but then just about 200 or 300 feet down below that, from the temple of Augustus, fascinatingly, we have what's called the Throne of Zeus. So remember, if you wanted to be an Olympic city, you not only had to be powerful and prestigious and wealthy and somewhat tyrannical, and you needed to dominate, you needed to procure allegiances, but you also needed to be capable of facilitating worship to Zeus, the greatest god of all the gods, the god that the Greeks and the Romans nicknamed God the Father, because he was the father of all of the gods. And so we have right here in this massive area, look at how massive this is. Look at all the tiny little people. I mean, you got thousands upon thousands of square feet here. Right at the very dead center of this temple was a worship to Zeus. Now you can see the kind of smoke and flames that were going up there, but this was a temple that people would go to every single day to offer sacrifices to Zeus, offer worship to Zeus, to engage in sexual immorality and promiscuity with the Zeus priest and the women and the men who lived in that temple. It was called the Throne of Zeus. Now, the reason why this was nicknamed the Throne of Zeus and not the Temple of Zeus is because of what it looks like. I have another picture here, gives you a better perspective. This is actually a modern day kind of restoration of the actual temple. And I want you to look at this, just kind of how it was built for a second. The reason why it was called the Throne of Zeus is because if you just imagine how this thing was situated, you've got the steps leading up, and then you've got these pillars on the sides that go around, and in the ancient version, it went up, around, and then it lifted in the back. Now, I want you to look at this and go, what would it look like if there was a god just about that size who decided to sit down in the temple? What would it look like? A throne. Do you see it? Use your imagination a little bit. Legs, middle, arms on the rests, and then there the god would sit. And so people in Pergamum, Greeks and Romans, because now they were all kind of mixed in because the Romans dominated the Greeks and they kind of interchanged and kind of became one people. So the Greco-Roman world, led by Caesar, led by their different kings and leaders, they would come to this throne and they would say, let us go to the throne of Zeus. And let us worship the God the Father, God, the Father of all the gods. And while we're at it, let's go worship Augustus, the Son of God, the God-man. The people of Pergamum, the city of Pergamum, was full of all of these opportunities to worship in these different sectors. The emperor worship, the throne of Zeus. And because of this, guys, they became prime picking to become an Olympic city. Prime picking to be a place that hosted the gods, that hosted the ability to be world renowned. This was a huge deal for them. Now, after seeing what I just showed you, the picture of the city, the throne of Zeus, the temple of Augustus, one of the very first questions that you should ask if you're kind of thinking about this historically is you should ask yourself the question, well, how on earth could a city like Pergamum become a city like this? Because if you think about it from a historical perspective, Pergamum is not near Rome. Like it's in Turkey today. And if you think about Turkey compared to where Italy is, or even Turkey compared to where Greece is, the reality is, guys, is that where Pergamum was in where what we call Turkey, but Asia Minor, it was nowhere near Rome. Nowhere near where Athens was, nowhere near Olympus, nowhere near where Caesar even resided. And so it's an interesting scenario for what we would consider in our minds. Like this would be like if someone were writing the history books on big cities of the United States and they had to write an entire chapter on the city of Detroit, right? And if you went to Detroit 100 years from now, you'd see all these ruins and it used to be this massive city. And you'd be like, why is this city so big? This place is cold and wet and dirty and it's just blah, right? And then you would have to look into the history books and find out that Ford and all these different automakers were there. And the history makes sense. Why this city would have been so big even though the location wasn't that great. Well, the reality is that Pergamum became this city, not because of its proximity to Rome, not because of its proximity to Greece, none of those things are the reason behind why it became so powerful and became an Olympic city. The reality is that it became this, and it got the honor of hosting the throne of Zeus and the honor of hosting the temple of Augustus because it was given what is called the Rite of the Sword. This is a Roman term, Roman militia term, military term. They were given the Rite of the Sword. Now, what does that mean? Well, in about 29 BC, about 130 years before the book of Revelation was written, the city of Pergamum was not owned by the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire, you got to think about Alexander the Great. Eventually, Alexander the Great dies. He ends up just giving out his kingdom to all of these officials. Eventually, Rome shows up. They take over. The city of Pergamum was one of the only cities that was able to withstand the fighting battles of Rome to take over them. And so for 150 years, Pergamum, in the midst of this massive Roman Empire, was completely autonomous. They had their own governors. They had their own source of economy and income and wealth. They went through 150 years of successfully fighting off Rome, successfully fighting off Caesars, successfully fighting off everything that Rome embodied until 29 BC. In 29 BC, they came to an agreement with Rome. They were sick and tired of the civil wars. They were sick and tired of all the dynamics. They knew that they could keep going, but the reality was that it would be better for them to put their allegiance towards Rome, to place themselves under the Roman Empire. And so after 150 years, they came to Rome, the Roman leadership, and they said, we will now give ourselves to you. We're gonna lay ourselves down before you. We're gonna enter into the Roman Empire. We're gonna lead the whole Asia Minor people into leadership for you. And Rome did something incredibly rare the moment that happens. They gave them this phrase, the right of the sword. What that meant was Caesar met with the leadership of Pergamum, 29 BC, and it lasted for over 200 years. And what this meant was that as a city, they were able to do anything and everything they wanted without any oversight at all from the Roman government, as long as their allegiance was to the Roman government. So if they wanted to become an Olympic city, which they ended up becoming, if they wanted to become a city that was known for its worship to Augustus and its worship to Rome, and they wanted to clean up the place, and they wanted it to look spotless and amazing, and they wanted to tear down any religious opposition that existed from other groups, or if they wanted to ruin any economic situation that may have been infringing upon the king and his kingdom, they did not have to take somebody and say, hey, we're gonna put you in prison and we're gonna try you, and then you're gonna maybe have to go to Rome one day because then you're gonna be tried before Caesar and all of that stuff. They didn't have to do any of that. They were given the right of the sword, which meant that if you cross them in any way, shape, or form, any military leader, any governing official, any police force individual, which they didn't have police, but you kind of understand what I'm saying here, anybody with any sort of authority could murder anybody on the spot and it would be guilt-free. If we wanted to clean up the city, if we wanted to stop worship to a foreign god because we needed to become an Olympic city, you either get in line or you die by the sword. There was no trials in Pergamum. There was no debates on whether you were innocent or guilty in Pergamum. You either got in line or you died by the sword. And so for 100 years, the reason behind why Pergamum became the city that we see in these photos is because they were tyrants. They murdered, they destroyed, they squashed down, they lifted up who they needed to, and no one held them accountable. Whoever owned the sword in Pergamum owned you as a person. By swords, by thrones, by allegiances, this was the expectation of Pergamum. And with all that context in mind, Jesus decides that he needs to write a letter to this church. Undergoing the sword, undergoing persecution, undergoing whatever is happening in their context. And Jesus has a very specific word for them. Revelation 2. I think you've maybe wondered, are we ever going to get to the scriptures? Yes, we are. This is that moment. I gotta help you guys out. Revelation chapter 2, verses 12 through 17, which, by the way, as I read this, things are going to make sense now. Before you'd have been like, what? Now you're going to be like, oh, thanks, Josh. Verse 12, to the angel of the church in Pergamum write, these are the words of him who has the sharp, double-edged sword. You guys remember that description that we were given of Jesus in Revelation chapter 1, where John's sitting there on the beach and he's worshiping, and he's like, oh Lord, and he's caught up in the spirit, and then he hears this voice behind him, and it's Jesus, and Jesus is like, John! And then he turns around, and it's not Jesus, but it's Jesus. It's like the Son of God, Jesus, but he's got these brazen bronze feet and this white wool hair, and he's got this like amazing tattoo on his arm, and he's coming down on a white horse and all these things. And it says that this God, man, this Son of God, this Jesus Christ, had a sword sticking out of his mouth. This is the only time in the book of Revelation that Jesus is described like that again. And it just so happens to be to a city that was held under the oppressive power of a sword. Jesus says, these are the words of him who has the sharp, double-edged sword, the sharpest of all types of swords that can cut down and up, splitting the soul and the spirit, splitting righteousness and justice from oppression and brokenness. So Jesus says, these are the words of him who holds the sword. Verse 13, I know where you live. Now, at first you'd think Jesus is like, hey homie, I know where you're at. You better watch yourself. Now, that's not what Jesus is saying here. He's not like threatening them. He's going, I know where you live, which would be deeply comforting for a Christian. They're going, we live in hell. This is a horrible city. Pergamum is a wicked place. And Jesus says, I know where you live, where Satan has his throne. Well, we already know what throne Jesus is talking about, right? The throne of Zeus, where people would go daily to offer sacrifices to God the Father. This corrupt, broken system, this place of prestige and power that gave the Greco-Roman Pergamums all of this, we're an Olympic city. Jesus says, I know where you live, where Satan has his throne. Not where this fake god Zeus is. Not where this God that everybody thinks, the almighty Zeus. No, that's Satan. That's the oppressor. That's the broken, fallen one. And I know where he lives. He has his throne. Yet, he says to them, you remain true to my name. So he's saying you're going through persecution and suffering and heartbreak because of this power of this sword, yet you stay true to me. You hear me, you know my name, you follow my name, you trusted me. You did not renounce your faith, so you didn't deconvert, you didn't choose to run away from me, not even in the days of Antipas, my faithful witness who was put to death in your city where Satan lives. Now he's referencing there to this moment. We actually have this in the historical writings of the Roman literature in the city of Pergamum. There was this guy named Antipas who was a part of the medical guild. And if you guys remember last week, we talked about guilds. I'm not gonna go into a whole thing like that, but he was a part of the medical mafia, medical union, so to speak. And as a Christian, Antipas did not want to participate in worship unto the god of Zeus. He felt this internal conviction of saying, I am now a follower of Jesus Christ, the true king, the king over all the world. I'm not gonna follow my guild into the wicked practices of Zeus worship. Well, the problem is that he lived in a city that didn't give a rip about his convictions. And so this city, by the power of the sword, what we know in the history books is that Antipas was the very first martyr we read about in the book of Revelation. He was killed for his faith in following Jesus. Antipas was murdered because he didn't want to go with the ways of the city, no matter the cost. And so Jesus says to the church, man, you guys did a great job. You didn't renounce your faith. You didn't step away from me even when death came knocking on the door of your friend Antipas, my faithful witness. Verse 14, nevertheless, I have a few things against you, Jesus says to them. There are some among you who hold to the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to entice the Israelites to sin so that they ate food, sacrificed to idols, and committed sexual immorality. Jesus is referring back to the Old Testament in these 3 chapters, it's 4, it's Numbers 22 through 24. And if you know this story, it's where the talking donkey is, which we won't get into that. But there's this moment in Numbers chapters 23 to 24 where there is this false prophet, Balaam is how you actually have to say, there's like an apostrophe there, but we'll just say Balaam for short. Balaam was this false prophet. Balaam spoke wicked things or wanted to speak wicked things against the people of Israel. Balak was the king of the Moabites. And the king of the Moabites wanted to entice the Israelites to claim allegiance not only to Yahweh, but also to the Moabites and the Moabite gods. And so in that whole kind of weird story in Numbers 23 through 24, the king of the Moabites actually tries to get the false prophet to go to Israel to pronounce judgment upon the people of Israel so that their allegiance would no longer be with Yahweh, but it would be with the Moabite king and the Moabite gods. Now, the story goes that the moment that the prophet actually ends up getting to the city, God actually deceives him, manipulates his brain. He starts speaking promises over Israel. It's this really cool story. But what Jesus is saying here is that there's a whole group of people in this church that are being enticed in some way, shape, or form by teachings that look a lot like the teachings of this king. to have your allegiance not towards Yahweh, the God of Israel, not towards Jesus, but to another God, to another king, to be manipulated, to be coerced in a specific way, to do things like sexual immorality, eating food sacrificed to idols, doing things that worshiping Zeus would look like. And so he says, there's some of you that are doing that. In verse 15, likewise, you also have those who hold to the teachings of the Nicolaitans, which would have been very similar teachings. Don't follow the true God, follow a false God. Find a way to, the wiggle room, find a way to find the gray in your faith, so to speak. Verse 16, repent therefore, otherwise I will soon come to you and will fight against them with the sword of my mouth. There's another statement about the sword. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who is victorious, I will give some of the hidden manna, this life, the eternal life you can get from Jesus. I will also give that person a white stone with a new name written on it, known only to the one who receives it. So this is the letter that Jesus writes to the church of Pergamum. Now, after reading this and after me kind of giving you guys some specific historical details, biblical context, historical references and stuff like that, the reality is that all that I've already said in the last 30 some minutes, where you've got the history of Pergamum, you've got the whole Olympic City stuff going on, you've got Jesus's words to them, and then you add in the Antipas stuff, the Balak stuff, the Balaam stuff, the Nicolaitan stuff, the sword stuff. It could be very easy for all of us in the room, and me included, this last week, I kind of felt this. It could be very easy to see all this, read all this, hear all this data and all this information, and be incredibly overwhelmed by what Jesus says here. Like the amount of data that you needed to receive just to even understand when Jesus says, I know where you live, where Satan's throne is, it's a lot. And because there's a lot of data, a lot of information, our tendency can be to think that Jesus' message to this church, because the data is complex, because the information is complex, that Jesus' message to this church is also complex. The reality is, guys, is that is not the case at all. What Jesus says to this church, given its context, given the historical reality of what's going on, is actually very simple. It doesn't mean it's not convicting, doesn't mean it's not challenging, but it's actually very, very simple. I want you to imagine this whole entire scene, because now I've painted the picture, so to speak, and we now need to look at it, okay? I want you to imagine this. Here was a church, the Church of Pergamum, I'm assuming that's their name, church residing in the city of Pergamum, that happened to live in one of the most anti-Christian cities in the entire Roman Empire. This was a city that stomped down anything that looked like Jesus. This was a city that by the power of their sword could ruin you, destroy you, could force you to do things that you never thought that you would be capable of doing, all because they knew that as leaders, as officials, they could slay you in a moment. Not many Christians in the first century could actually lived in a city so corrupt as the city of Pergamum. So they lived in a city where their life was on the line almost every single day of the week. You either worshiped Zeus or you died. You either worshiped Augustus or you died. You either joined a guild or you died. And if you didn't go with the way of the sword would go against you. Persecution, fear, brokenness. This is the dynamics of them. And then Jesus references this guy named Antipas. So they know that there was a gentleman in their church that loved Jesus, but even when he went against the very system, he was also murdered. He was also killed in cold blood, became a martyr for Christianity. So they are infinitely aware that their allegiances are torn. If I follow Jesus, I may die by the sword. If I follow Jesus, I may lose everything. And so because of that fear, because of the very real reality that they were dealing with this tension of if I follow Jesus, I die, some in the church, which is what Jesus says there, some of the people in this church started looking for another way to follow Jesus. They started looking for another way to live in that specific city, in the city of Pergamum, that wasn't as disruptive, that wasn't as chaotic. Maybe, just maybe, according to the people who lived in this city and in this church, maybe there was a way of following Jesus that didn't require you to lose your life. Maybe there was a way to believe in Jesus, to have faith in Jesus, to not renounce your faith in Jesus, and yet still claim allegiance to Rome, to Zeus. Maybe there was a way, and so they started searching. And in their searching, they found people like Balak and Balaam and the Nicolaitans, people that gave them a third option. People that gave them a way out of the tension. Do I follow Jesus or do I die? Do I become faithful to Christ or I die? And what they did is they offered them a convictionless Christianity. They said, go to the temple of Zeus, worship Zeus, partake in sexual immorality, God will be okay. Eat food sacrificed to idols, it'll be okay. Worship Augustus, it'll be okay. We'll find a way around this. Jesus will be okay with it. He understands your circumstances. They went searching for people who convinced them that they could be Christians that never had to actually go against the sword, or that they could be Christians, and this really applies to us today, that could go with the sword. Not against, but with. This was their circumstance. And so they found somebody that while they were stuck between the rock and a hard place of salvation or the sword, they said, well, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? And they went, well, we've got this option right here. This option that maybe if we follow Jesus this way, we won't upset our political leaders. Maybe if we follow Jesus this way, we won't ruffle the feathers of those who oppose us. Maybe if we follow Jesus this way, we can actually wield the sword ourselves. We can actually have influence and power and authority, and maybe we can actually somehow creep in, like the ways of Balak and Balaam, and we can actually start leading and taking ownership and taking authority. I bet when we first started talking about the city of Pergamum, your thoughts were, how could this possibly relate to me in any way, shape, or form, right? And yet now we live in a world where almost every single Christian in the United States is vying for power. Are we not? 2 weeks ago, Christians vying for power, no matter which political side of the spectrum that you're on. The left wanting their power, the right wanting their power. And fascinatingly enough, Christians finding all sorts of ways to say, well, their sword's the right sword, and their sword's the right sword. But they did that because they're fighting for the right things, and they're going to implement the right ways to do things, and they're going to take down and destroy the people that embody what's against that sword. And then the other people were like saying the exact same thing. And it's interesting that we may not live in a country where the sword is absolutely against us as Christians, which, by the way, the persecution here is nothing compared to being a follower of Jesus in Asia or in China or in India or in Russia. That is not what we experience here. But what's fascinating is that we are all pulled towards this weird desire to not go, oh, do I get killed by the sword because of my salvation, or do I run after Jesus in this capacity? Like, we don't deal with that tension. We go, which sword do I grab? Which power play do I have? Guys, the Church of Pergamum was struggling in a unique way, but it's not unlike ours. And the fascinating thing is that Jesus has one specific word for them. They were fearing the sword, and they tried to figure out a way around it, but he had one word for them. I want you to look at verses 12 and 16 again. This is very important. 12 and 16. To the angel of the Church of Pergamum write, these are the words of him who has the sharp, double-edged sword. Verse 16, repent therefore, otherwise I will soon come to you and will fight against them, meaning the people who are deceiving themselves, the people who are going against the will of God, even maybe the them being the political powers of the Pergamum system. He's saying, I will fight against them with the sword of my mouth. So guys, what is Jesus saying here? Like, put yourself in the context, understand what's actually going on. This is a church going, Jesus, if we follow you, the sword will go against us. Jesus, if we surrender to you and place our allegiance under you and we go the ways of Antipas, we will die by the sword. And so we got to figure out a way around this, Jesus. We don't want to die by the sword. We don't want to go against the sword. So we got to either come under the sword or we got to come above the sword so that way we can wield the sword, because we got to save our own lives. We got to fight for ourselves. We got to preserve our own lives. And Jesus says to them even in their greatest intentions, he goes, you're afraid of the sword? You're trying to take the sword? You're trying to own it or hide behind it? I'm the sword. I'm the one who, when I speak, life begins. I'm the one that when I speak, oceans quake and mountains move and the creation exists and the cosmos comes into being. You are afraid of some man on a throne, but you're not afraid of me. You're not willing to follow me. You're afraid of your own life. And so you'd rather preserve or take hold of power when I'm the only one who owns the sword? Friends, Jesus is fuming at this church because they have forgotten who he is. They have forgotten that he is worth being followed even unto death. And they have forgotten that Jesus is greater than Caesar. That Jesus is greater than any right of the sword. That Jesus is the burning Savior, white wool hair, flaming sword out of his mouth. They have forgotten who he is and who he was. He says, I am the sword, follow me. And he says, if you don't follow me, I'll actually come against you. The sword may actually find its way against you. Lighthouse, I want you to listen to me. This is going to push your buttons, and that's just how it goes. We live in a world that is not much different than the city of Pergamum. We live in a city that is not much different than the city of Pergamum. If you look at our world today, what does everybody want? Power. What does everybody want? What does everybody crave? Influence, authority, the ability to wield a sword. And our world, and all of us, to be honest, latch on to these people, to these identities, to these things for fear, for worry. Swords are being swung daily, and the reason why they're being swung in your face on Facebook and Instagram and on all these news channels and in every circumstance of your life, every time a sword is swung by someone who wants power, what they are doing is they are swinging it in demand of your allegiance, in your trust, in your faith. That's literally what the word faith means in the Greek. It's pistuos, which actually means to place yourself under one thing and to abide in that thing. And so every single time our world swings a sword, they're saying, will you follow me? Will you abide in me? Will you trust in me? Sometimes a sword is a political party, and that political party deceives you into thinking that they wield the right sword. And you go, oh my gosh, I absolutely should fall in line with the Christian sword. And then another party says, no, we fall in line with the Christian sword. And all they're doing is vying for your allegiance. All they're doing is convincing you, saying, well, if you grab this sword, then you won't experience that sword. If you join us under our allegiance, then you won't have to deal with the tension of being a part of that group. They wield the sword for our allegiance. Maybe we live in a world today that maybe it's not political for you or whatever, but the reality is that our world swings its sword when it comes to approval. Will you think this way? Will you act this way? Will you do what we say is right or wrong or helpful or good or tolerant, like we talked about last week? Will you fall in line, or will you be on the quote unquote wrong side of history? But who owns history? Who owns the world? Who owns the sword? Guys, we live in a world where people are swinging swords all day long for affirmation, for affections, for your desires. They're being swung for your allegiance. And you need to know, especially in a world that we live in today, no one actually owns the real sword. No one that you're putting your trust in. And by the way, I know I'm gonna hit on some of you guys. I'm not flirting with you, that's not what I meant here, but jam on you, whatever. A lot of you have allegiances that you are not willing to give up because you have been convinced that that is the allegiance of the sword of Christ. You have become convinced that the way you think, the way you act, the way you live, the way you vote, the way you work, the way, whatever it is, you're convinced that somehow that's the best way to be a Christian in this world. But the only way to be a Christian in this world is if you believe that Jesus is the sword. Jesus is the word and the truth and the life, and you follow him and you follow nobody else. And what that looks like, friends, is you start upsetting everybody else who carries their fake swords. You're not for sale because Jesus already bought you. Was that a daisy? Yeah. Don't be bought, friends. Don't fall into what the Church of Pergamum was dealing with. Fear, anxiety, wielded swords. What do we do? What do we do? What do we do? Zeus, this, allegiance, I don't know, the sword. And then Jesus goes, I'm the sword. Follow me. If you die, so be it. If you live, so be it. Follow me. Swords are swung daily for our allegiance. And so in response today, friends, I just wanted to remind you of this truth. That's all I wanted to do. I wanted to remind you and provoke you. Jesus is the word. You base all truth, all relativity, all objectivity, all subjectivity upon him. Jesus is the sword, and he will cut whatever he needs to cut. Jesus sits on the throne, every throne. And Jesus demands our allegiance because he has earned it. So today as we sing, I asked a Daisy this week, I said, I want every single song that we sing to be songs of allegiance, songs of declaring that Jesus is king, and songs saying, God, I'm gonna give everything that I have to you because you own it all. That's all I want us to do today.
Sing that again, worthy. And worthy is the Lamb who was slain. Holy, holy is he. We sing to you, Lord. Sing a new song to him who sits on heaven's mercy seat. Every voice we sing holy. And holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. With all creation I sing praise to the King of Kings. You are my everything, and I will adore you. filled with wonder, awestruck wonder, at the mention of your name, Jesus. Jesus, your name is power, breath of living water. It's such a marvelous mystery. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. You're worthy, Lord. With all creation I sing praise to the King of Kings. You are my everything, and I will sing holy. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. With all creation I sing praise to my King of Kings. You are my everything, and I will adore you, Lord. We adore you, Lord. You're worthy. You're worthy. You're worthy. There was a moment when the lights went out, when death had claimed its victory. The King of love had given up his life. The darkest day in history. There on the cross they made for sinners. For every curse his blood atone.